welcome to part 2 of Healing the Clairvoyant. If you have not already watched part 1, please go and do that. Otherwise, you are going to be pretty lost and lacking key information in order to follow along with this lecture. So I actually, in the description box, I have a link to my website where I have created not only a presentation to follow along with both part 1 and 2, but also a study guide / workbook so that you can kind of figure out how to apply these things to life, because it's one thing to sit here and take it all in and attempt to intellectualize it, but as long as we intellectualize it, we are not embodying it. We are not bringing it into our lives in a way that is practical and in a way where it can actually begin to work on us and begin to heal us. So I think that's very important, and I wanted to provide that resource for that reason. So I recommend just immediately going and clicking down there and opening the presentation to follow along. And then after the fact, going through the workbook and kind of following along at your own pace. There is no rush to do this, and it is not being graded. It's just for fun and your own growth. So we are going to jump right in and talking about the 8th sphere. And as I said in part 1, I go over this extensively in my course, Overcoming the Lower Doppelganger, because that's a very foundational course if you are looking to heal and overcome psychic trauma, overcome the lower centers, addiction, PTSD, things that have really held you back on your spiritual path. That being said, I am just going to begin reading from the presentation so we can follow along together, and then I'm going to add some things along the way. So the 8th sphere is the junk drawer of the astral plane, and that's really what it is. When you think of a junk drawer, it's things that don't belong, things that don't have a place anywhere else. And so the 8th sphere is this place that is made up of everything that is fallen and degraded and no longer serves a purpose, no longer has a place, and has nowhere else to go. So it's the subnatural plane. And the 8th sphere is also the false light, because what ends up happening is we have these beings and they don't have anywhere else to go. They have no way of getting fed and getting energy unless they take it from us. And so they will come to us with these lies and deceptions, trying to get us to give them their energy or to create a form for them to inhabit. And this could be a physical human form that they want to seek to possess and inhabit, or it could, which would not last very long because it would make the body very sick and you would decay and devolve rapidly. But more than likely, and what we're going to see more and more in the future, is that it is going to need some sort of automaton or something to inhabit, because it cannot actually sustain any kind of organic substance. It would kill it very quickly. So the 8th sphere presents dressed up lies and temptations designed to trap the undiscerning in decay and illusion. They will say absolutely anything to get you to believe that the 8th sphere is where you belong, because if you buy into their lies, then you will begin to create the world that they require in order to inhabit. So it's very important that we understand what the 8th sphere is, because if we don't, we could be buying into ideologies and practicing systems that are not actually designed for the human being at all. They are not designed to sustain the human form. They are designed for the subnatural. And that's a very dangerous place to be. And so it's so important that we have esoteric study and that we have a solid foundation, because we cannot even begin to dip our toe into psychic development if we do not first have this foundation, because we will be snatched up so quickly. And if we do not have discernment, then we'll buy into anything that makes us feel better, or that sells us an answer to one of our problems or whatever. So for example, we see people who they have no problem with the concept or idea of getting a chip put in their brain because they've been in chronic pain for so long. And the idea of inhabiting something with their consciousness that is a cyborg or something of the like, it's not even that offensive of an idea to them, because they are so tired and exhausted, and they've been in pain for such a long time that they just want to escape that pain. They just want relief. And so you have these subnatural beings that are pretending to care, and they are pretending to kind of enter into a relationship with a certain person through the guise of, I want to make humanity better. I want to do this thing that's actually going to help everyone, when realistically they are doing so from a very selfish place, and they have these motives to make our entire environment subnatural and synthetic, because they cannot survive in the organic plane. It has rejected them. The human form rejects them. They can't survive that way. So unlike the black sun, the eighth sphere is not a place for transformation or growth. And I have seen so much conflation with this, and I clear this up in the workbook a little bit, but this really stems from kind of the new age idea that every single thing is actually something that is a reflection of us and something that needs to be transmuted through us. And so there's this belief system that something like the eighth sphere couldn't actually exist, or anything hell-like could not actually exist, because that's just our projection from our own wounds. That is an extremely dangerous belief to have, because if you believe that something like that isn't real, if you believe that the lower astral doesn't exist, these subnatural beings that seek to take advantage of you, they don't exist, then you are in the perfect position to be deceived by them. You are in the perfect position to be targeted by them. And that is why we see so many people within the new age pushing these very anti-human agendas and approaching spirituality from an extremely dissociated place. So in your workbook that I created for you, on the page that says the eighth sphere, I write, disclaimer: a common misunderstanding that I've seen within spiritual communities, especially within the new age, is the conflation of the black sun with the eighth sphere, and vice versa. While there is overlap, these concepts are not the same and come with their own mysteries and complexities. This confusion seems to have its roots among New Agers holding a limited understanding of shadow work that negates the possibility of any influence operating outside of the immediate self, or the I. I, as in the letter I, our individuality. The argument is generally one that claims that failure to accept the eighth sphere and the beings and forces it houses and integrate them or it into ourselves or into society is a failure to integrate an aspect of humanity's shadow. While I understand the thinking behind this, it heavily lacks context, and this misunderstanding can open up humanity to the acceptance of forces and influences that are not looking to be transmuted, thus spreading across humanity like a spiritual disease or mind virus, which is exactly what we see happening. So as you can see, if you have your workbook pulled up, I have a diagram that to me really represented the eighth sphere, because it kind of made me think of this technological grid almost. And the eighth sphere is really the lower aspect of Earth, but it's separate from it in the sense that everything has broken off. It has devolved, it's degraded, it's no longer of an organic substance. It cannot be reintegrated. There's no transmuting it. It is too far gone. And that, we just can't pull that back into ourselves because it won't survive in that atmosphere. So the concept of the eighth sphere is so, so, so important to understand if you want to have any psychic practice at all, because it is the understanding of the lower astral. And especially if you are coming from religion or from the new age, religion approaches this and it just says, this is hell. And if you don't do XYZ or believe XYZ, then you're going to go there. And that's it. And then the new age says, this is the lower astral, but the new age tends to not be clear on what that is. There's no real description of it, no real description of what resides there or how to know when something is higher or when something is lower. And a lot of things that are lower and that expose themselves through fruits of anti-spirit, because this is how we measure things. We need to have an understanding of what the fruits of God are, the fruits of spirit, the fruits of the spirit, or the fruits of anti-spirit are, the fruits of materialism. If we don't understand that, then how are we measuring this? By our feelings, by how something feels to us. And so this is how people fall into the false light, because something will kind of caress their nervous system. And I experienced this a lot in charismatic Christianity, where you have all of these intense experiences where your nervous system is just so overwhelmed and overstimulated. And there are these intense experiences of pleasure and laughter and crying and to the extent where you can barely stand, and there's no fruit that comes from it. It's just an intense experience that overwhelms your nervous system, and it causes you to, in the moment, believe that you're having that experience because you are coming into contact with God. But if you were really coming into contact with God, then your life would begin to change. And there would be a consistent transformation that would begin to happen, where there was healing and there was recovery on a very deep emotional and spiritual level, as opposed to what generally happens in either religion or in the new age, where you need to constantly chase these experiences. And when you're not having these experiences, you think something's wrong with you. You think you're doing something wrong. You think that because you aren't overwhelmed with holy laughter or having this intense experience where you're seeing all of these things or hearing all of these things or whatever, that you must not have that connection to spirit anymore, and you internalize it. You start to feel bad about yourself, and it creates this very unhealthy relationship, which is the exact same relationship that we see with people who abuse plant medicine, and who, with some people who enter into spirituality through ayahuasca or some sort of similar, LSD, mushrooms, whatever. And not to say this happens to everyone, but there is definitely a subculture of people out there, and it does not take long to search the new age communities to find this subculture of people who believe that the only times that they are connected are when they are under the influence of these certain substances. And their life is not actually changing. Nothing is transforming. They actually begin to decay over time and densify over time, because they end up in these cycles where their life isn't changing. And so then they have to take more LSD or take more mushrooms or, go on another ayahuasca retreat or whatever to re-stimulate their senses, and they end up having to do that forever to even attempt to sustain any type of spiritual awareness or any feeling of spiritual perception. And so it's the exact same thing that happens to so many people who have been caught up in the false light, where they end up chasing these experiences. And if I'm not having these intense experiences, then it means I'm doing something wrong. But as we begin to heal the psychic and heal the clairvoyant, what ends up happening is that at first our experiences can seem to become less and less, or less and intense. And that's not a bad thing. That's not a bad thing, because we actually are not intended to be overwhelmed within the nervous system. So what ends up happening is, as we begin to awaken higher clairvoyance and develop in the correct way, in a safe way, what we're doing is that we are becoming so grounded and so embodied that we are creating a capacity within the body where it can really handle these higher sense perceptions. And it's like our main senses extend like branches into the cosmos and into higher worlds. And our branches are becoming imbued with these higher forces, and it feels as natural as breathing. Once we get to a certain place with it, it's no longer dysregulating. It's no longer shocking to the system, because it was never intended to be. It was intended to be a normal extension of an already existing function. So we really can't heal as long as our idea of psychic development is fantastical and it's so far out there. And we think that being clairvoyant means that you just, everywhere you go, you're going to be having these crazy experiences. And that's not to say that you'll never have them. Of course you will. But the difference is that, number one, there will be fruit that comes from these experiences. They won't be just completely random things, because there are a lot of people who approach psychic development thinking that it's some kind of party trick. And it's so cool. I can tell people about this crazy experience I had with these things that I saw. And of course, I mean, it's interesting. Who doesn't love a good ghost story? But what's the fruit the majority of the time? Of course, we're always going to have some weird experience that we don't know how to explain. But the majority of our life should not be chaos. That is not a fruit of the spirit. That is not a sign that God is moving in our lives. Overstimulation is not a sign of Christ and an activation of the Christ impulse. That's just the truth. That's not what it is. So the eighth sphere seeks to overstimulate us. The eighth sphere has us in a place where we see everything mirrored back to us, but in a way that is incredibly distorted. And it's because it's a reflection of our wounds, and it's a reflection of our lowest beliefs and these unhealed aspects of ourselves, that it's these lower astral beings seek to grab onto and kind of nourish with their seductions. So if you are entering this because you want to be famous, or you want a lot of money, or something like that, they'll know that. They will know that. They will see that. These lower beings, they don't see the whole of who you are as a person. They can only relate to you based on the aspects of yourself that are the lowest aspects. They can't perceive anything above that because they're so fallen. So they see those aspects, and that is how they enter. They enter through these unhealed wounds. So if we want to reduce entity attachments, and we want to mitigate psychic attack, and we want to learn how to effectively protect ourselves, the first thing that we have to understand is the black sun. We have to understand the eighth sphere. We have to understand the difference between those two things. We have to understand where they overlap and also where they separate. We have to understand the nervous system. And we have to have, a foundation in esoteric study. So the final slide, which if you're following along with me is on page 6, is called Understanding Psychic Protection. And this one is really important because if you're anything like me, and I talked about this in part one, about how I went through this period of time where I was experiencing abductions and terrifying things, losing time, and I didn't know what was happening to me. And it was well beyond anything that was happening to anyone that I knew. And I would read stories from other people on the internet, and it felt like I was the only one. It felt like no one else was having these experiences. And so I'm like, I don't know what to do. And the internet's like, oh, you just need to sage your space, and everything's going to go away. You will be completely fine. Or you just need to envision a white bubble around you and these things will stop happening. But that did not work because I did not understand psychic protection. I had many doors open that I didn't know were open doors. And so I was extremely permeable, extremely open, extremely dissociated, and I had no idea how that was impacting me. I didn't understand how the nervous system impacted me spiritually, or how my dysregulation and chronic dissociation was making me wide open for all of these entity attachments, or how my trauma kept me locked in the lower centers and basically locked in the lower astral all the time. I didn't understand that. So it's so important for us to understand that you can't sage the trauma away. It doesn't work that way. We can't clear things that we are still inviting into our space. So first and foremost, we need to have a dedication to esoteric study, because if we do not understand what is happening to us, if we do not understand the cosmos, we don't understand spiritual realities and natural laws, we are not going to be able to protect ourselves in any way. It would be like attempting to fight a karate master when the karate moves that we know we saw in a cartoon or something, and we've never had any formal training of our own. There's just no way that we can compete with that. So we really need to have a comprehensive understanding of esoteric science. We need to know exactly what is happening. We need precision. If we do not have precision, we cannot be mentally prepared. We won't be physically prepared. And we are also very vulnerable to falling into the eighth sphere and being trapped, because we will be so easily seduced by things that sound good and that feel good. And if we don't have esoteric study, and we aren't dedicated, and we aren't constantly learning and basically being a perpetual student, then it's very easy for us to kind of abandon what's true and abandon reality for something that feels good in the moment. So embodiment, mental preparation, character, and integrity. This is what I have next for understanding psychic protection. And embodiment is exactly what it sounds like. It's the act of being embodied, being in your body. And that is in place of or opposed to being dissociated, being detached, constantly distracting yourself, trying to bypass things in your life, trying to throw yourself into social media and entertainment or virtual reality or whatever to escape. Embodiment is the opposite of dissociation and escapism. Embodiment is the opposite of materialism, because everything that is material is anti-spirit. Everything that is material is anti-God. And so what happens is we end up, when we become very material as individuals, we don't care about being in our bodies. We only care about what feels good. So if something doesn't feel good, then our impulse is to detach from it. Our impulse is to dissociate from it and to attempt to bypass it. And as long as we think that we can bypass our pain and our trauma, we may not really realize this, but what we're actually bypassing is our own evolution and our connection to higher realities and our connection to higher forces. Because you can't have your cake and eat it too. It doesn't work that way. We can't just connect to higher realms and then pretend that nothing else exists. That is the false light, because reality is balanced. Truth is balanced. So we have to have everything, and it starts with understanding that our psychic development begins in the human body, that the human body was created as a tool for psychic development, that every one of our senses is actually capable of extending into higher sense perceptions. So in order to really develop psychically, we have to first be embodied. Then we have to also have this mental preparation, which comes both from being grounded and also from a dedication to esoteric study. And then, and not just, when I say esoteric study, I don't mean just reading whatever new age books you see at Barnes and Noble or whatever, because that is not going to be genuine esoteric study. We do have to choose a system and kind of go with that, and learn everything that we can learn about that system. Because again, if we go back to any kind of skill that you want to create, it's kind of like that saying, a jack of all trades is a master of none. I do think that you can master multiple skills to an extent, but if you want to really be a master, something has to be leaned into the most, and we have to understand every corner of it. We have to immerse ourselves in it. We have to become so familiar with every single part of it, and then we have to integrate it into ourselves. And if we don't do that, then we will be seriously lacking in context. We will be lacking in understanding in our own history. And if we don't understand our history, we definitely are not going to understand our future. And we won't understand how the cosmos work. We're not going to understand what's happening to us. We'll have no understanding of the spiritual hierarchies. So we need that. We need that mental preparation along with being grounded and embodied. And along with the mental preparation, we need to develop character and integrity. Integrity is when we are who we say that we are. It's when we can be reliable. It's when we are imbued with the fruits of the Spirit, in the sense that they are a natural symptom. We aren't striving for them. They flow from us because of our connection with Christ. And because when we have a correct process of etherization happening, our blood and our form becomes spiritualized and imbued with these higher forces and these higher impulses. And so the lower aspects of ourselves, they begin to be transformed and alchemized. And in return, we are graced with these gifts of higher moral impulses. So it's not something that we even have to strive for or work for. And that doesn't mean that we're perfect, or that we're never going to mess up or make mistakes. Of course, we still will, because we are still human. But it's going to come so naturally to us and be symptoms of our connection with God. So we need to have that, because if we can't be good stewards of our own personality, how are we going to be stewards of anything else? If I can't have a strong character and strong integrity, if I can't be honest, if I can't own up to my mistakes, if I can't take responsibility, if I can't forgive, if I don't have compassion, if I can't be a good steward on the most basic human level, why would these higher forces ever make me a steward of higher knowledge? You know, why would they do that? So we really need to have that as well. Also, with understanding psychic protection, we have to understand the lower nervous system versus the higher nervous system. And this is my point where I'm going to say, I actually have a course that will, fingers crossed, it will be published at least by the end of December. I've actually, as soon as I finished my Overcoming the Lower Doppelganger course, I immediately turned around and started working on a course called Awakening Higher Clairvoyance, which some of you know, if you have followed me on Instagram, because I've posted about it on Instagram in the past. But I had started working on it, and then I took a break for quite a few months, and then I jumped back in. So in that course, I am going to describe basically what the foundations are for accessing higher clairvoyance, how we can develop psychically the correct way. And I really wanted to come out with this first because we shouldn't even be thinking about awakening higher clairvoyance if we aren't first healing the clairvoyant, if we haven't gone through those necessary steps, which is why I also think it's important if you feel like that's something that you need to consider taking my Overcoming the Lower Doppelganger course, because that it's very, very foundational in healing those lower impulses, healing from that pain, healing from that trauma, so that we can then move forward with developing these higher faculties instead of being in survival mode all the time. I spent so much of my life in survival mode, feeling like I could not move forward, feeling like I was just at a dead end all the time. And so we have to do things in order, because if you do things like me, you're going to be jumping all over the map. And so I went through my very complex experience, and I'm doing my best to organize it for you so that you don't have to go through what I went through, so that it's more organized. You have everything in one place and feel like you have at least a little bit more empowerment behind you and a little bit more structure, because I felt like I was just flying through space with no anchor, no understanding of what was happening, and I was just doing my best to piece these things together and to try and heal. And it helped me so much to begin to have this understanding. So in my course that, like I said, is going to premiere most likely by the end of December, it's called Awakening Higher Clairvoyance. I go a little bit more in depth on the lower nervous system versus the higher nervous system. And I talk a bit about etherization of the blood and reverse etherization, how that impacts us psychically. But for now, I'll say that the lower nervous system, it's associated with the sympathetic nervous system, but that doesn't mean that anytime we're in the sympathetic nervous system that we're automatically in the lower nervous system, because it just doesn't work that way. So the lower nervous system is when the sympathetic state, which is our fight, flight, fawn, freeze, becomes chronic. And we are chronically in a state of survival mode. And so that is when we drop into the lower nervous system. And some symptoms of that are being very disconnected, dissociated. We are mulling over our pain all the time. We have a victim mentality. And this is not something you want to shame yourself for, because if you have been through significant trauma, it makes sense. And quite honestly, it makes sense for anyone in 2024 going into 2025 to be in survival mode, because everything around us is toxic to the body and toxic to the nervous system. It's a lot to process. And these toxins, they aren't intended to be integrated. You know, we're not doing anything wrong by having this normal physiological response to a toxic environment. It makes sense. But we need to have this understanding, because there are ways that we can mitigate that. There are things that we can do to take responsibility and to take our power back into our own hands, even if it's very small things, to make certain changes to help sustain ourselves and to help fuel the higher nervous system. So the lower nervous system is when we are essentially just cycling in this pain and trauma over and over and over again. And that eventually, if we aren't careful, can drop us right down into the lower astral, where that is all we can experience spiritually. The higher nervous system, on the other hand, is when we are in chronic states that are parasympathetic. And so that is our rest and digest and relaxation. And that's when we feel safe and secure. We feel like we can play. We feel like we can laugh, you know. It's easier for us to access those holier emotions and to feel really deeply within our body the state of security. And so any moment where we start to get into the higher nervous system, we want to do our best to nurture that. We want to do our best to fuel that and to really meditate on it. So if you're in chronic states of survival mode, and someone gives you a compliment, that may be the only thing that you have to even regulate yourself with. And you want to pull yourself into that. And you don't want to associate it with them as if they are what's going to heal your nervous system. You want to detach it from them and instead think of how that compliment made you feel a sense of safety within yourself. And so the way that we can move into the higher nervous system is by beginning to feel and find safety within ourselves, which I have spoken about in multiple different videos. And one of which, I mentioned this before, but my video on 5G, Wi-Fi, EMFs, and the nervous system will be really helpful to go and watch if you haven't watched already, because I talk about all the different somatic things you can do to find safety within yourself. And it's really important. And we don't have time to get super into that right now. So I'm going to say you should go check that out if you haven't already. But I also have a free somatic shadow work journal on my website. It's right on the front page, where I give some somatic exercises that will also help to nurture the parasympathetic nervous system. And the parasympathetic state, when we are in those states, the more we're in the parasympathetic nervous system in a conscious way, where we are associating it with higher forces, we begin to develop these higher faculties because we are etherizing correctly, because the parasympathetic nervous system is very heart-centric. So the more we can maintain and nourish those states, the more we're going to be embodied in our heart and rooted in our heart, and really activating the heart, which is so important for psychic protection, because if we are not rooted and grounded within the heart, then we're going to fall right down into the lower centers. The heart, and this is something I have known for years, even before I had an understanding of occult science the way that I do now. I've been speaking about this for over a decade, specifically about the heart and how protective it is. And that's why having an understanding of occult science helped me tremendously, because I had this understanding, but I didn't know how to bridge the gap, because I constantly felt like I was cycling in this trauma, and it was very difficult for me to move out of it. And then once I had that nervous system understanding, it was like a light switch, and I was able to then do certain practices and revolve my life or rearrange my life in a way where I was engaging in somatic work and integrating somatic work into my day-to-day experience to be able to transform my experience so that I could access the heart more. Because we can't do this logically. We can't just intellectualize our experience. It has to be embodied, and that starts with the nervous system. If we don't feel safe within our own body, we can't feel safe anywhere else. We will not feel safe with any person, in any environment, in any spiritual experience or spiritual condition, if we cannot first find safety within ourselves. It is of utmost importance. So regulation of the nervous system, building the capacity to work with fear, because it's okay to feel fear. It's okay to have that come up as an initial response at times. But when we know how to resource safety within ourselves, we end up being able to regulate ourselves so that when that fear comes up, we don't stay stuck in that state. We don't stay locked in that state. So again, the nervous system is extremely important, and I am not going to go super in depth on that because I don't have time to. But I have plenty of free resources on my website about this. I'm going to link some together. So if you click on the link in the description box, I have additional resources on the nervous system on my website already there for you as an additional study guide. And so the final thing here is prayer, ritual, and guarding the heart and mind. Prayer, I think, is so important, and I know people have a lot of trauma around it. There's a lot of misunderstanding of what prayer is, because prayer is it should never be about projecting our will onto another person. For example, I pray that this person ends up in a relationship with me. I pray that that this person gives me a job. I'm praying that I get $50,000. It's not about projecting our will. Prayer is about surrendering to higher forces and impulses. And actually, prayer, there's a very specific way that we are intended to pray. And I really love the act of prayer building. And so writing a prayer that is centered around an understanding that Christ is within me and reciting that, the activation of higher moral impulses, surrendering to spirit, praying for things such as humility and strength, because that is what we need to pray and ask for. We don't need to pray and ask for $50,000. And that's not to say that you can't ask for your material needs to be met. You can. But we need to first and foremost prioritize making sure that our spirit is in alignment with certain things, because if it's not, then material things aren't going to come our way like that either way. It's just not going to happen. Not as a punishment, but because we won't be in a place to be receptive to it, because in order to receive things like that, we really have to be operating from the heart. So ritual and guarding the heart and mind, this is so important. We need to, when I say ritual, I don't mean like ceremonial magic, or you can do something like that. You can do some sort of protection ritual. But I mean, what are you doing every single day to posture yourself to higher forces, to position yourself in a way that is reverent, to posture your heart, position your heart towards reverence, towards Christ, because that is what is going to protect us. That is how we protect ourselves. And guarding the heart and mind, above all else, we have to pay attention to what we are taking in terms of media, in terms of music. We need to pay attention to the people that we're surrounding ourselves with. We need to pay attention to the things that we read, the thoughts that we think, the feelings that we feel. And this doesn't mean that we bypass them. It means that we need to be self-aware and taking responsibility when things do not line up with our highest self, when things do not line up with who we want to be. We need to look at why this thing is coming up. We need to look at, why do I always feel jealous about this person? Why do I have so much unresolved anger with this situation? Why am I struggling with pride in this area? Why can't I feel gratitude? We need to look at those things and then try and work with them and see what small changes we can make to integrate the higher aspect of that, because every lower aspect has its higher condition. And so this is really about balance. That's all of this is. It's about balance. And that it often looks like, how can we alter this 1%? How can I change this 1%? How can I grow 1%? How can I have 1% more gratitude, 1% more faith, 1% more regulation? We don't need to set these unrealistic standards for ourselves. It's not going to help anything. We should only move as quickly as the slowest part of ourself. Okay? We can't just wait for this wave of motivation and then think that we can take that as far as it'll go and that's going to help us. It needs to become so intricately a part of our day-to-day experience, to where every thought that we have, to the best of our ability, we are measuring that, asking ourselves, what fruit is this bearing? Not in the sense of judging the self and overanalyzing the self. It's about being conscious and acting as an observer to the self, so that we can lovingly redirect the way that we would a child. If you love a child, you're not going to spend all day nagging them and shaming them. But if they go to touch a hot stove, and obviously that's harmful to them, you're going to explain to them why that's harmful to them and redirect them to something else that they can do that isn't going to hurt them. We need to become a lot more comfortable with doing this with ourselves. Because why aren't we? This kind of behavior needs to be something that we integrate into our own lives, so that we can actually see real change. And it often starts with 1%. And then after we have changed things 1%, alchemized things 1%, disciplined ourselves 1% for a certain amount of time, then maybe we can up it to 3%. It's a slow process. It's a step-by-step process, but we can get there. So that being said, that is the end of Healing the Clairvoyant. And again, don't forget to go and click on the description and go through the workbook if that's something that you feel called to do. And keep an eye out. Stay tuned for Awakening Higher Clairvoyance if that's something that you're interested in, because it lays out the foundation for you to do this stuff yourself. And because it's not going to be as extensive as Overcoming the Lower Doppelganger, it is going to be more affordable. So yeah, that's all. Thank you so much for being here. Please, I would love to hear your experiences in the comments, and your thoughts in the comments. I really enjoyed the comments that I was getting on part 1. So, and some people even commented saying that they enjoyed reading the comments on part 1 too. I love when you guys share. I love spending time with you, and I'm so, so thankful for you. God bless.